I want to welcome everyone to the PARC Forum. My name is Kyle Dent. I'm a researcher here at PARC. I lead the group that works on dialogue systems and intelligent conversational agents. And it's my pleasure to introduce Igor Geopolitical, who has been involved in this area for many years, going back a time. He's currently the CEO of Prion, where they work on enterprise applications of speech technologies. He was named an industry luminary by Speech Technology magazine, and he's been involved in startups and early efforts at large companies leading to products like IBM Watson and the Amazon Alexa. He was awarded the Eisenhower and Truman National Security Fellowship, where he explored the role of entrepreneurship and venture capital in addressing geopolitical concerns. He serves as a mentor in the TechStars Alexa Accelerator. He was a Blackstone, North Carolina Entrepreneur-In-Residence and a founder of the chapter of Global Shapers, which is a program of the World Economic Forum. And it's a great pleasure for us to have him here at PARC today. Thank you.
So I was thinking that this bottle, this must have been bottled in San Francisco because it appears a little bit crooked. So I'm very OCD about certain things. Just to pique your curiosity, so where did we get the name Prion for the new company? That was Alexa's code name, the engine before it turned into that. So that's where that name came from. So, not to challenge you, but in some ways we failed because we actually work for these machines. If you look at what percentage of the population has a computer science degree, what percentage of the population is a mathematician, an engineer, somebody that works in our arts and sciences, relatively few, right? So a small subset of us figured out assembly code and algorithms and MATLAB and all of these other things, and we know how to instruct these machines in order to do the work for us. And certainly PARC is a great bastion of that, being one of the first to figure out the more natural forms of human-computer interactions. And yet, what's really, really interesting is the solution to all of these problems in terms of how we can onboard the rest of humanity to interface with us was literally under our noses itself. So that's what I've always been excited in speech recognition from an early age. In fact, there's something that I'll tell you that probably our marketing people don't want me to say. I want you to know how early on I was intrigued by this. I was born in Greece, to a little island where they had no running water, no electricity, no radio, no television, or anything else. But there was always this dolphin that would come into the lagoon. And so if you think about all the places that you can be inspired in order to do your life's work, I would look at it and wonder, how could I talk to this animal? You know, how could it talk to me, right? And all of these things that are science fiction dreams, right? If you read an Asimov's Foundation, and then eventually all of this mathematics that was supposed to predict the future is now what we call big data and constructs that are quite prevalent. Same thing with some of us dreaming about machine translation and interacting with the natural world around us. Now, how did we think of addressing that? Well, at IBM we had different programs for doing that. At first, before smartphone app stores and these types of experiences, before Android devices and what have you, we had the web, right? So things went from web, mobile, and AI. Well, when they were web, we were trying to figure out how do we blend text to speech, speech to text, ASR, TTS, into your desktop browsers for accessibility purposes or otherwise more natural forms of interactions. How do we put them inside of Windows mobile devices, Symbian devices, and all of the early smartphones that existed way back when. So that's what intrigued us. And certainly that's when we started thinking that we could maybe build portals and things of that sort inside of these speech-based experiences. And so when I was still there, I was quoted talking about how I wanted to not quite talk to the dolphins yet, but at least could we talk to these television sets, okay? It's because that seemed like child's play compared to the ultimate goal of interacting with the natural environment. Now here's what was frustrating. And when I got the cover of this magazine, Popular Mechanics, I practically threw it across the room because they took my quote and they connected it to a title called American 2025. The last thing I wanted to do for something that I already had in the lab with our teams at IBM Research and what have you is wait 25 bloody years for something that we already had working inside of the labs until all the business folks got their ducks in a row in order to bring it out to fruition. It did take a while. You know, let's call it a halfway point when the Fire TV was released with speech ability in 2015. Now, we were experimenting with other works as well. We were thinking about how do we have microphones inside of people's homes activating their environments. And at that time, if you remember, IBM was working in partnership with Toshiba and Sony on the cell architecture. And there was all these PlayStations that were inside of people's homes. And we started thinking with array microphones and what have you, could that become the hub for all sorts of natural interactions inside of people's homes? And so that's where our minds were thinking about. Obviously, each node didn't have enough memory and processing power in order to do the things that we wanted to do with natural speech or transcription, but if we connected all of these things together, where could we get to? And so the things that people think of as Watson, all the basic constructs existed in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and there I was working with our teams on things that we called multimodal portals. And guess what? We couldn't get them commercialized. Nobody understood, and I couldn't guarantee that IBM could make $100 million within 1 year of revenue with these constructs. And so when people think that this is a great accomplishment in 2011, you know, people like me, and obviously many of you in the audience that work on some of these more the fundamental works and the forward-looking works, just sigh, because we knew that we had the same thing 10 years prior. Now, what did we end up doing? I couldn't get it greenlit through the investment review board in the first year I tried. And I tried in the second year I tried. I couldn't get it through. I couldn't get it through the third year that I tried, right? I mean, I'm working for this big edifice with vast resources and what have you, and I'm trying to get it through. Couldn't do it. Meanwhile, all of my peers were saying these other businesses needed more support. Of course, they ended up face planning and what have you, but you know, I won't sign guarantees. And I'm sure you will imagine that Amazon probably made a little bit north of $100 million off these platforms now. Now, talk about being water around a rock, right? Try checking off some of the things that go into our DNA as entrepreneurs, right? Not just innovators, but as entrepreneurs, right? If my grandparents and great-grandparents that worked in sciences and engineering and things of that sort when they came over from Europe, in this case in the 1950s, were used to comfortable discomfort. And there's nothing more of a comfortable discomfort than going out and doing a startup at that point in time. And so in 2006, that's when we started the last company. By the way, this is interesting as far as a lemonade stand goes. Most people say that you have a much higher probability of getting venture funding if you opened up a business below the age of 12. Much higher probability. Now, let me tell you what the probability is for you getting venture funding. Even though you think it's so prevalent in this market that you can get all this venture capital funding, you still have a higher probability of slipping and dying in the shower than getting VC funding. And so when we raised our first Series A, you should have seen how carefully I would step into the tub every morning after that point. Now, what was my first startup? My first startup actually wasn't at age 12. I'll tell you the first one and the second one. The first one, I think I was around age 5. I had all of these books that I read 100 times over on that island that had no libraries or things of that sort. So I opened up a little book, a little table and what have you, and I put all of my books down in the village marketplace, and I ended up selling off all my books, had all this money in my hands, and I waddled over to my mother and I handed her all my money and said, buy me more books. So entrepreneurs don't really wait for authority figures to give them permission to solve problems. So that was startup number one. Startup number two, by the time I got to the US, I was in this Catholic school at that time. And these nuns would walk past my desk and they would look down at my chair and there would be these dimes taped to the bottom of my chair once a month. So after 1 month, they would observe there was these dimes. After month 2, they would observe that there were more dimes. After month 3, they observed even more dimes were taped to my chair. So they finally asked me, why are there these dimes, taped to your chair, and why are there always more of them than there were the previous month? And I said, well, listen, I noticed that you don't have any equipment to do any sort of science experiments. And so I had asked all the students to start pooling our resources together so we can start buying different things to use in our discoveries. And conversely, you always, in some ways, to do well in startups, you have to have both a scientific curiosity and also that entrepreneurial twist where by age 10, I discovered subscription revenues, right? Recurring revenue streams. And so we ended up bringing out and creating the baby version of Alexa that was on a little AT&T flip phone, and nobody knew what the heck we were showing when we did this at TechCrunch in 2007. And there it is, over there on a little J2ME device. Obviously she didn't have a name or anything of that sort. Not only that, we were blended into a prototype of the iPhone that nobody ever saw before. It was based on the iPod OS because some of the early engineers that worked on the iPod that were at NVIDIA, and prior to that they were at Portal Player, were working with us, and we were trying to explore with the Apple team what future interactions would look like on these mobile devices. This is a depiction of what it looked like. Now, look at those little graphics in the J2ME app. Doesn't that look like a YouTube accessing that and doing shopping, doing searches, doing all sorts of things in the palm of your hand? And that's exactly what we were shooting for. Now, Guy Kawasaki happened to be there and looked at it and said, I don't get it. I think you're going to be blown out of the water and this isn't going to work. But we kept going, thankfully, after that. We ended up pitching this idea to VCs. None of them got it. They're like, why would you talk in order to do a search? Why would you talk to shop? Why would you talk to message or any of these things? Why wouldn't you just pick up the phone and just handle it that way? And so nobody wanted to fund us for this multimodal portal, right? This is before Siri. Nobody knew to call this an AI assistant or Alexa or anything of that sort. And so nobody got it that way. But they're like, well, I have this telecom portfolio company that's harvesting a lot of voicemails. Would you let them use your speech cloud in order to convert their audio files into text? I'm like, fine. Consolation prize, if you don't get funding, you get a customer. Then we went to this second one. They're like, okay, we don't get this, but can you let our messaging company use it? Fine. A third one, there used to be white label search engines that were competing with Google at the time. Well, can you let them do voice search? I'm like, fine. Ultimately, I always wanted my portal that knew everything that you wanted, including why is the sky blue and everything else. And yet we started building a business of call mining and voicemails and searches and things of that sort. Sprint ended up becoming a customer. We had Microsoft as a customer, dozens of enterprise and carrier customers. I think we had almost 50 million unique voices intercepted by the time we were acquired. And so here are early examples of transcribing things into voicemails, early examples of doing machine translation on these platforms in different languages, And we were even blended into prototype versions of AOL Instant Messenger that none of you ever got to consume. I never saw. I did have an occasion to rib Steve Case on the fact that they missed out on their own version of Alexa way back when. We tried getting our thing into Blackberries, into Palm Pilots, into Nokia, everywhere you can think of that people were carrying on different forms of devices. We were trying to have conversations with all of them to get the stuff blended in. And we even continued to have Skunksworks projects on creating new forms of messaging experiences. Marcelo is still the head of product management at the Amazon Echo, and so all the things that you now know as Alexa messaging were getting discovered in the 2011 timeframe. And so we ended up disappearing. In 2011, we ended up disappearing, and the R&D team and the IP and the engines and everything else that were that company, which was called Yap, ended up turning into the first AI-related acquisition that Amazon had at that time. And Google, don't be saddened, Google had a chance, Microsoft had a chance, Apple had a chance. The reason why my team wanted to go to Amazon is because they wanted to go somewhere where there was a blank canvas, absolute blank canvas. They don't need to merge with an existing speech team, an existing AI team, and the world got to see their fingerprints. Now, what does AI in general mean nowadays, right? Certainly for those of us that have been practitioners, it's as an ambiguous term like cloud. None of us that work in the field would have ever called anything cloud, right? We didn't. In fact, even when we got to cloud, in some ways it was accidental. When I shipped some of our first products, when I took over the groups at IBM, and by the way that I did that is I just kept sending them notes until they sent a terse reply that if we let you lead these groups, will you stop sending us damn emails? They got so tired of me badgering them with all of these ideas for the group. But with the cloud stuff, back then when we would ship WebSphere voice server and things of that sort that were behind the scenes on Tell Me, behind the scenes on Google 411 and things of that sort were the IBM speech engines. Well, I was so excited to ship our first products, I had asked the sales engineers to come in and show me how these things were consumed. And they literally rolled in one server, a second server, a third server, and a fourth server, and they came in with a stack of 100 CDs. I kid you not. I looked at these 100 CDs, all these fixed packs and voice portals and WebSphere this and DB2 that and MQ series this and everything else, and no wonder we weren't selling anything. It was so cumbersome in order to consume that. And so that's what started our thinking around stepping back. If we create a hosted version of this, could we get higher velocity? And as a result, if you look at all the improvements in accuracy, it also happened because we're able to ingest all of that data into the core. And so companies like McKinsey now, right, are talking about how all these big enterprises need to pivot to AI. The ones that do are going to double their cash flows. The ones that don't are going to lose 20% of their existing cash flows within the next 10 or 20 years. And so they all need to pay attention. Certainly the reason that they need to pay attention is Apple, Google, Amazon, and similar entities are going to keep throwing vast resources at this problem. Why is that? Whoever creates AI assistants ends up owning the glass and the relationship to end user. So you can imagine a day, if you're Delta Airlines, you probably don't like it when you'll say, hey, book me a flight to Boston. And Amazon's choice for a flight to Boston is JetBlue. Everything becomes a commodity. I need a ride share to the airport. Something shows up. It could be Uber, it could be Lyft, it could be an independent contractor. It doesn't really matter. Everything becomes commoditized to the lowest possible cost or the entity that's paying to become part of that ecosystem. That's why this is so deadly of a transition for most brands. And so when you think about these voice assistants, obviously the reason why we got to a level of accuracy that's considered superhuman accuracy in some ways. Obviously, the innovation since 2012 with the neural nets. But the thing that was most important is the fact that you have common platforms, so you can create acoustic models across a wide user space, and you can collect all of those into a singular cloud and then adapt models even more aggressively. Now, these things are in a mess of homes now, right, since this came out. So now we have these Siris and these Googles and everything else that's everywhere. Almost 38% of American homes. That's not bad for something that came out of nowhere. Now, I'll give you more insider baseball. When the team was read into the ECHO program, they were all absolutely depressed. They thought this thing was failed, just was stupid. It would just sit there. And they're like, what are we supposed to do with it? It's just sitting there. When they were read into the Fire Phone, they were all excited that this thing was going to be the next iPhone and it would take off like crazy. And it just shows you the exact opposite happened. The thing that they thought was wonderful and would have great adoption ended up falling flat on its face, and the thing that everybody would have predicted would have been a total failure ended up doing quite the opposite. That's what was actually funny about the original business plan that we wrote for that first startup. Wrote a 100-page business plan. The 50% that anyone in this audience would have bet their life on, none of that stuff came true. The half that I just put in as filler just to try to give people a 360 view of everything that could possibly happen to us, that I was laughing while I was writing that portion because I thought I was needling VCs and just putting a whole bunch of crap in there. All that stuff came true. So it's sort of like the John Wanamaker quote, right? Where it's like, I know that 50% of my ad budget is wasted. The problem is I don't know which half, right? And so these things now do all these nice things for folks, but we lose sight. A lot of you think these technologies in some cases are luxury items. I can get up and go across the room and flip a light switch. I can do this, I can do that with them and everything else. But in some ways we lose sight that from an accessibility standpoint, we end up activating members of our community that we didn't even know before. Brooke reached out to me and said, you're one of a multitude that worked in these arts and sciences, and I want to thank you because otherwise I would have not been able to further my education and even participate in our economy. So what you think is a luxury item in some cases is completely changing the course of some people's lives. And frankly speaking, all the pain in the neck that is running one of these companies really becomes worthwhile when you hear about just a singular story like that. I mean, it just makes all the BS worth it. Now, what's happening in the workplace, right? We know that consumerization of IT happens, right? What does that mean in plain speak? Somebody starts using Facebook at home to interact with friends and family members and things of that sort, and somebody else scratches their head and realizes, wow, that is also relevant to the workplace. I need to interact with my customers and my partners, and thus something like LinkedIn is born, right? Some people start using Twitter, here and there, and somebody discovers we need Yammer, we need Slack, we need these types of constructs in the workplace as well, and a similar thing is going to happen with these AI assistants. Now, they have a mess of challenges though, right? Because these enterprises are fragmented, heterogeneous, fractured. They have cumbersome regulatory and confidentiality requirements, HIPAA, PCI, and the like. There's all sorts of security challenges with respect to leveraging consumer hardware and what have you. And then most of everybody focuses on consumer monetization because that's where there's clear utility. And so, knowing all those challenges, I fell asleep in late January of 2017 or early February. Fell asleep. Not in the middle of the day, at nighttime when normal people sleep. So I was between startups, so I was getting a little bit more sleep at the time, which is welcome. I had this zany dream. How many of you saw that film, Jiro Dreams of Sushi? All right? Isn't that great to find somebody doing that and being so passionate about that? Well, I dream of AI. That's what's in my dreams. You know, when I was in high school and things of that sort, I don't know what types of posters that my peers had on their rooms, maybe some supercars or airplanes or tanks and things like that. I had Seymour Cray. You know, that was my hero on my wall there. And so I started calling people after that dream. I'm like, hey, I think I just solved something in the accuracy and security of AI. I called some friends at Alexa. I'm like, you guys should steal this idea. You need to put it in there. And they're like, wow, get this funded and we'll resign and join you. And I'm like, are you crazy? I don't want to run another of these things. I don't want to deal with any more VCs or what have you. They're a pain in the neck. And I hung up the phone. Then I picked up the phone again. I dialed the next person. I'm like, hey, I think I solved something that's important to Watson. You guys should steal this idea. It's like that book, right? Steal this book. You know, it's like, steal this idea. You need to take this and put it in there. I think it'll help. And the next thing I hear on the line, there's a little bit of a pause, and then he's like, I'm in. I'm like, what do you mean you're in? Well, I don't want anybody to be in anything. There's nothing to be in on. He's like, I'm in. I'm like, okay, I'm going to hang this up. Then I call somebody at Cisco, and I start telling them what this is all about, and they're like, okay, we'll buy it. I'm like, what do you mean you'll buy it? I don't have anything. It's just me. Me and maybe a PowerPoint. I can make you a PowerPoint about this stuff. You can't buy anything. There's nothing here. It has to become something tangible, like a lopsided water bottle. You could buy that. This has more value than a PowerPoint does. In any event, it ended up being a humbling response when we started talking to people about this. Now, remember when I mentioned that gentleman said that he was in? This wasn't just anybody, okay? This was David Nahumu, who is the head of human language technologies at IBM Research, an IBM fellow, and just a great visionary in this space. Do you know how long he's been working on these problems? Okay, you do, okay? The fact that he's willing to join is telling everybody that we are the next evolution of something. And let me tell you why. Let me show you a letter that he carries in his briefcase every day. Pan Am flight. Remember Pan Am? I'm trying to mimic slow writing when people used to actually write these letters. Let's see who wrote this letter to him. Fred is one of the earliest luminaries in this. And this is dated 1981 when he said statistical-based AI is the future. And in that letter, he describes all the possible ways that this is going to affect people's lives in the future. We carry the baton. Who cares what brands we work for? This is the type of work that we do. It doesn't matter if there's an IBM logo behind us, a Google logo, some startup logo, or anything else. We've always been passionate about moving these concepts forward. And so after all that, even though I only type with 2 fingers, I sat down and I started writing a single one-pager, because I started cursing the whole time I was writing this one-pager, because I didn't want to get funding anymore. I never wanted to do such a thing again. But here's what's interesting. 1 page turned to 2 pages, turned to 3, turned to 4, turned to 20, 30, 50, 100. That's how you know you're passionate about something. And of course, maybe my chosen field is boring to people outside of this room. But when I crossed paths with a VC that wanted to introduce me to a Bank of America executive, I had run some other ideas with her in the past. And she's like, Igor, tell him what you're up to. And I started telling him what we were up to. And then she just started laughing and interrupting me. And I'm like, Amy, what's so funny? Are you stopping? Why are you laughing like crazy? I'm serious. I'm trying to describe what we're working on. She's like, you're glowing like a pregnant woman. Now, when are you going to get it out? So that's what we're inherently doing. I mean, we see that the world is going to be encumbered with a mess of these different AIs, and we think that we're going to throw it out and start from scratch with the way that it should be organized in order to get the accuracy and security that people need. And so here's an interesting story about this fish in a blender. This happened at a modern art museum in Charlotte. And so I just want you to think through how these businesses are typically built with the mindset of non-linearity. So at some point in time, a cruel artist decided to put this fish in a blender. Okay. So you walk past this display and it's, there it is. You have to look at this fish in the blender, and everybody's standing around this thing and wondering what to do and everything else. And this one frat boy decides to impress his girlfriend. I'm just going to press the button and blend this fish, and people are horrified at, it's all forms of humanity are interacting with this blender. I look at it, I'm annoyed. I look around and I find the power plug. And I go to unplug this blender. The artist had glued that. So if you think about that there's nonlinear paths to success, that poor fish, when it was put in there, probably thought it was doomed, right? But I remembered on the third floor, there was something else there, right, to put two and two together. So I ran up there while everybody else was rotating around this fish. I remembered that there was a display of make your own currency and things like that. I ran up to the third floor. I ran back down, walked right in, looked down, and took the pair of scissors that were there and cut it. The reason why that's a metaphor, right, is the fact that that's what entrepreneurship is in some ways. It's uncomfortable. People present these types of problems. This is actually similar to the way Yoko Ono and John Lennon met, didn't they? He had an apple, or she had an apple out there, and she was very perturbed that he breached in there and took a bite out of the apple. But in any event, these things are not 2018 constructs in terms of AI. They were built a long time ago. People are iterating on these types of things. There's going to be new novel permutations of it. I still want to talk to dolphins. Our people in the company say, don't say that too much to people. It seems a little crazy, but there's a lot of things that we take for granted nowadays that seemed a little bit crazy. I think there will be an immense connection with nature when we can actually talk on their terms rather than the other way around. I think, independent of that, we have so much to do. People ask me what the end goal of speech recognition is and where it's going. And I think it's similar to the delayed reaction Einstein had before he started communicating. I think it'll get to a point where you won't have to talk to machines anymore, because obviously with predictive and prescriptive and things of that sort, it'll just ambiently do all the things that we need it to do. Using speech recognition is only going to be an exception process. But the path between now and then, as you interact with these systems right now, if you actually listen closely to your interactions with Alexa or Google Assistant or what have you, you're giving the verbal equivalent of DOS commands and variables. You're giving them too much in some ways. Why? Because we don't yet have platforms that can do appropriate sensor fusion as humans, where I can point to something like that and say, tell me more about that, and through a combination of eye tracking, head tracking, gesture recognition, and what have you, you're able to deal with ambiguous inputs and figure out what I'm doing. Not only that, it's not just about waiting for input. It's about a machine interacting with us and essentially asking us for insights. Now, when I also talk about non-linearity, when you run these types of businesses, there's a lot of other things that come into play vis-a-vis IP and the forms of competition that you find and everything else, and certainly there's a great many entities out there. And of course, the Y Combinator folks talk about you basically have to just compete with yourself. It's a rare company that fails because of competition. It's more because they didn't execute correctly. In many cases, the ones that do end up working themselves out, they just figure out the packaging for it. You can have less sophisticated forms of these things that you package appropriately, and you end up getting much greater adoption. For instance, one of the things that the Apple team brought us into that we all had a problem figuring out. And I'll give credit to Apple for this solution and to Amazon for a similar style solution. How do you talk to these things? Do you know how many smart people still don't know how to activate a microphone on one of these assistant applications? Do you press and hold it down like a walkie-talkie? Do you press the button, talk, and then have a silence detection? Do you press the button, talk, and then press for end of file? Do you know how many people mess that up? And then if you press it too soon, you drop the last phoneme or something like that that throws off the one or two words towards the end, or you may not get the last word. Well, in the case of Apple, as we were interacting with them, we just figured out you have a proximity sensor. Since nobody can figure out how to activate Siri and press it on there, just bring it up to their ears, turn the microphone on when it feels that it's close, and then when you turn the microphone off when you put it in front of people's faces. That's how they solved that. In the case of the Echo, that's what was brilliant, right? That's what the breakthrough was, right? In terms of having these hot words, right? That wake words and things of that sort. Now, a lot of people give the array microphones a little bit too much credit. It's a hyper-tuned acoustic model because you know exactly how many of these things you're going to ship, and you can start customizing models specifically for that platform. But the fact that it just sits there waiting for people to activate it, that's what was one of the biggest deals for hands-free, for people interacting with these things in their homes, for toddlers and things of that sort. But there's a great many problems that are still unsolved. I think we will get to a point where you won't have any hot words. That's an obvious one. These things will be able to tell the difference between humans conversing with each other and you conversing with this thing. There's very subtle things that are going to change, and I'll know that. So in any event, there's lots still to be done. The other thing is the privacy stuff that a lot of people are worried about. Vis-a-vis, is this all going to go to the cloud still, or are we going to be able to do some sort of edge processing in order to preserve, your profiles and things of that sort, so you don't feel like it's, feeding Facebook or Google or these types of entities. And certainly, as I mentioned before, you're going to have similar problems in the enterprise space. So let's go a little bit more interactive, because here I am talking about conversational systems, and yet I'm just a little robot, talking and projecting myself to you. I think.
Let's first offer our thanks. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll come around with microphones. We have one on the other side too. Wait until you get the microphone so that we make sure the recording captures everything. There's one here. I got it.
So when I try to talk to Siri or Google, it might be 85% correct in terms of finding the words, but it's only about 30% successful in doing what I want. And so, for instance, my wife just refuses to even think about using it.
Well, that's...
Is that going to, how rapidly is that going to change?
How rapidly is that going to change? Well, that's why I'm out of retirement again. Seriously, I'm so frustrated. In some ways, you hand some of this work off to large companies post-acquisition and things of that sort, and they're supposed to run the ball forward in certain ways, and then you get frustrated that things aren't moving fast enough. Look at all the stuff that we had at IBM at that point in time. Of course, I can talk to my television. I had so many whiz-bang features on my smartphone, 10 years before other folks have, just like you've all accessed things in your own labs that are 10 years ahead of their times as well. And it's frustrating, not to see them in market. So everybody's now pivoting to figure out what the conversational AI and how to bulk up the accuracy on the other side. Because I won't say that speech recognition is fully solved. Of course, it's solved for high-def audio and a single speaker into one of these devices. If you don't have an impacted environment, you don't have an impacted speaker who's a non-native speaker or what have you. But the other side, in terms of understanding what you actually want to do, and then think about that. What does it have credentials to unlock in your stead, and what needs a confirmation from you? There's just so much to do there. In some ways, I think these systems end up being glorified with mechanical Turks. I mean, isn't that exactly what's supervised learning in some ways? I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, you would ask where was Captain Kirk born, and it would have no idea, and now it magically knows, where Captain Kirk was born. How did you think it learned that? The machine didn't learn that, right? Just they saw enough of those style of utterances in there, and there had to be a human actually, inputting that knowledge in there and inserting it into that. Can you imagine if a student, required somebody to point blank train them on every single concept, and there was no one-shot learning or things of that sort? Nobody in our field would have ever called any of this stuff AI. It's just not that. It feels like an entity. It feels like an organism, but it's not that. It's not doing all of this stuff. It's not sensing, and it's not reasoning this stuff on its own. So we have a ways to go. Please.
Yeah. Are you using AI to help you in your work? Are you using AI to help you in your work? And if you are, how? And if you're not, why?
That's actually a great question, and I will mention David again, because he left his ivory tower job at IBM and showed up to this startup. And by the way, his family members are joking all the time, because they're like, wow, he looks happy every day and what have you. And I'm like, I'll have him wearing a backpack and eating avocado toast and drinking nitro coffee in no time. And they said that he looks 10 years younger now for working in the startup. But what's hilarious is he started pointing out all the things this little baby company didn't have relative to his last experience. He's like, I had a technical assistant, I had an executive assistant, I had this support for travel, I had that support for conferences, and this to do my expense accounts, and all of these other people that supported my function as an IBM executive. And I'm like, David, there's a very easy solution to all of these disconnects that you feel we don't have in our meager company. Just build the bloody AI to do all these things for you. So those are all the things that are missing. A lot of people try to paint such an aura of complexity around AI. Do you know all it is when we talk to these CEOs of these big companies? An AI is nothing more than a synthetic entity that you're hiring into your company. And it sits there, and like any normal human that you would hire into your company, it doesn't know what it's doing on day one. That's it. It just sits there and it learns. And the things where we know how to create these AIs, all we're doing is automating tasks that we as humans already know how to do. We're just doing it in a far more efficient way to scale, right? If we took a whole bunch of Kodak prints, a whole bunch of photos, and threw them on the floor here, we can do all sorts of problems with them. We can say, hey, let's separate the dogs from the cats. Let's find all the pictures that have the color blue. Let's find all of the things that are scenes of a beach and things like that. The only thing we ended up doing with AI is we ended up automating some of our senses that we use in the ways that we describe these things, because we can create models for the way that we think about sorting these stuff out. Now, of course, there's opportunities with all the deep learning stuff in order to have it just find things, and we don't even tell it what those things are. And then later, we use our reasoning to find out the interesting patterns that the machines found. Oh, you found these constructs here, and we can label them as frogs, right? But the machine has no concept of this entity versus that color versus this gender versus this place. So, long story, of course I want to use it, right? Of course I want an AI that runs the totality of my business, so that way I can fixate on the things that require a little bit more creativity and imagination. We're not there yet, but we are building something that will hopefully get us there, at least for work.
So are you implying in that last answer that what you're calling creativity, I would also call inferencing. And are you saying that all this AI is just statistical AI, or you're rejecting the idea of abstract reasoning and inferencing? What's your thought on the old symbolic AI versus deep learning?
I think you always end up somewhere, not in the way that you expect, right? I mean, it'll do something, and there'll be some benefit to it, and there'll be some curse to it. To be able to make some prediction, it's the same way that I typically get these questions of, oh my gosh, this AI is going to remove all of these jobs, and all of these people are going to be out of work, what's going to happen? And yet these transitions in the past happened, and people adapted, and the multitude of us that are sitting in this room have jobs that did not exist around the times of our parents and great-grandparents, and now they exist. We have to trust that the future will adapt itself, where there will be new types of work. From that standpoint, I still think that, of course, some of us are working on how do we not work on AI, but how do we work on augmented intelligence, right? Because one of the things that we learned from the Watson experience, that a human's reasoning was capped at 67%, and a machine's recall was capped at 72 or 73% trying to solve that task. But within a couple turns, if we had the human working with the machines, we can nail a 100% fill rate, to that solution within a couple turns, right? So we're still participants in that. And maybe the instantiation of what the solution looks like is sort of a hybrid person that has certain augmented capabilities through implants and things of that sort. But that's where Philippe Starck, the designer, looks at these phones, these black slabs of screens, and eventually says there is no more design left when these things just disappear, and you need a Wikipedia entry of something, you blink your eyes, and that concept just appears in your head. So where does that machine intelligence then end, and where does the human intelligence begin when you can't really tell what's an independent thought versus which one was implanted by some sort of knowledge retrieval? That's where the things eventually will go to, and that's a whole different ball of wax when that happens.
Excuse me, I'd like to, the end result of my question is going to be, what are you guys doing next along this line?
Mm-hmm.
But it follows on to the question that was just asked, and it circles back to that very first question you were asked. The person's wife gave
Mm-hmm.
up on the assistant because, frankly, the assistant was too stupid.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it wasn't doing the speech recognition right.
Right.
You gave that wonderful 95%.
Mm-hmm.
That's not been the problem. The problem is they don't know anything. And so you keep asking them things, and they keep coming back with, I don't know, or they give you some stupid answer. The reason is because people like you tell other people that you hire this person in, and this person is a blank slate, and he knows nothing at all, and he will learn it day by day by day by day by day. That's not true when you hire a person in. You're hiring a big knowledge base into that company that's been trained with a lot of concepts and words and problem-solving skills and so many other things that can be built upon to make that person a valuable employee. So that means that guys like you are going to have to change from speech understanding guys to what's the world all about guys, and how do I do things, and how do I problem solve? What are you doing along that line? I mean,
Okay.
no one wants to buy a bunch of Echoes. They
Right.
don't do anything.
All right, that's good. That's good. Now, of course, we don't just put a blank slate in a company. It's already has some capability and some functionality. But think of a new hire that shows up. How do they learn about the environment that they're in order to be an effective member of a team? They have to read things. They have to talk to people. They have to sense the organization around them. Those are all the things that are missing in things like Alexa and Siri and things like that. Does your Echo have eyes? No. I mean, what does it read? What have you given it access to so that it understands your world? It hasn't read all the books you've read, and yet you're going to challenge it with concepts that are rattling inside of your head for the places you've been and the books that you read and the media that you've consumed. Yeah.
What are you
That's now I walk the tightrope, right? Because now we're starting to talk about people's privacy. Do you want me to have access to every book that you've read and every piece?
Yes.
Okay, if I have that, then yes, I can.
What are you gonna do?
What's that?
What kind of AI person are you gonna hire?
All right. In some ways, right now, people are creating vertical domains, meaning I'm going to do something that can answer HR-related questions, and I'm going to do something that can answer procurement-related questions. That's what people are doing right now, is they're creating these vertically oriented AIs that they know that they can keep the beam fairly tight and get decent accuracy for very specific use cases. The world is making those things. We're making the thing that lives on top of the world that's making those things. That's what we're doing. Because we know that there's a multitude of different startups that can at least get somewhere by focusing on these specific tasks, right? So if you think about a given company hierarchy, it hires researchers, and it hires engineers, and it hires people in the mailroom, and it hires accountants and lawyers and all of these different folks. And you're right, in some ways we're a combination of horizontal knowledge and vertical knowledge. I'm just using the example of the vertical knowledge here. So where does the horizontal knowledge come from? All right, in some ways, each of these entities can have some for out-of-scope questions, but there still needs to be an overarching architecture that all of these things are going to be plugging into so that you can have a unified interface. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. When you ask me a question, you're attributing the answers to me. All right, there you are, there I am, and I'm answering your question. It's not coming from me, right? Just like those answers wouldn't be coming from Alexa. There's educators in my minds and colleagues, and there's consensus and expert opinions and things that are rattling inside of my head that I need to veto because I don't really like those opinions inside of my head. And I present it to you through a unified dialogue for you to access that information. Explainability exists. You can ask me what my source and method is for some of these answers that I'm giving you, and then you can figure out whether the credibility is up or down based on that. All of those things don't exist with Alexa. The security aspects of it, right? Where you and I can talk about, you can ask me a certain question and I'll answer it, and maybe it'll be generalized, but we go behind a locked room, or we go in some company and under non-disclosure, and you can ask the very same question and you get different knowledge. Or you'll get different knowledge when you're in the different points of interest. The thing is, these things are so rudimentary right now, they don't understand context and other things that they need in order to generate the accuracy that you want. Of course, all these consumer AI companies, they want all of that knowledge in order to become more personalized. And of course, there's going to be some resistance to you giving that information because it's a little bit too much information. We need information to do something. Right now, whatever that is your life sits behind the interface, and you get to control how much of it you share with the world. When it's residing in data centers, God knows where, that makes people uneasy, right? It's sort of like the metaphor that people typically use about having children, right? Which is having a child is just having your heart living outside of your body. That's what an AI assistant is for you. It's your mind living outside of your body. How are you going to police it? How are you going to make sure that it's getting fed correctly? How are you making sure that the right people are influencing and interacting with it? Those are all the things that nobody's really touched upon yet, because people are still trying to sell you dog food.
Yep, okay, hey. Thanks for your talk, Sean Crotty, VMware, former PARC. Your bio mentions a couple fellowships about addressing geopolitical concerns. Is Prion playing in that space? Are you purely business industrial?
We are not purely business industrial.
Of AI to addressing geopolitical concerns? Will it help? Will it hurt?
Yeah, I'll give you an easy one.
Will it run away with itself?
Okay, good. There's always the question of friend or foe at a certain point in time. You know, I always say technologists can't get famous unless one of the Snowden leaks contained their work. There's more planes grounded in the Air Force than there are flying. Why? They don't have enough people that have the knowledge to work on these things, right? So we don't even have augmented reality where people can call on mentors just looking at these different things and interact with manuals of different types. So that's an easy example where everybody can get around that. Of course, there's a military application, right, in terms of interacting with complex machinery, but there's all sorts of commercial applications. In fact, I can look at something and point at it and say, hey, why don't you call somebody that can help me fix that? Right? I just looked at it, right? We can infer what I'm looking at and what have you, and I'll call the world's leading expert for that. And now I can converse with another human that AI is listening the whole time that I'm conversing and learning the next time that, because we're not scalable. A subject matter expert is not scalable, but it can learn, all right, next time somebody's going to have a problem with those lights up there, I'm going to have all of this knowledge that I've intercepted ambiently, and now I can start taking off. That's a neat and tidy way of thinking out. Geopolitical concerns was something else. Running a VC-backed is so annoying, I thought that one of the easier things to do afterwards is go to the Middle East and figure out and solve the ISIS problem. You know, just a little, because dealing with VCs is a pain in the neck. Now, what do we find when we start studying the interplay of the intelligence community and venture capital and everything else? All of this stuff is entangled and intertwined, right? And I was actually looking more that those societies there don't have upward mobility. So it actually was a Disney-esque theme of, well, maybe all these young men and women that are getting agitated and turning into extremists don't have the opportunities that we have, where I can show up at age 6 and not speak a word of English, and then 2 or 3 decades later have myself an education, work for a great brand, start my own business, and these types of things. Whereas there, all wealth is collapsed, to a fine point there. And even if you are an entrepreneur that has a neat idea, in some of these countries, somebody shows up and says, okay, I'll fund your idea, but I'm going to own 99% of it. You're going to get 1% because otherwise you'll be unemployed just like the rest of your friends, right? That's what they're doing. They're predatory. They're not letting people share in that wealth creation. And as a function, they have a relatively stagnant economic system where they're not distributing things and creating that positive flywheel that we need to have people like me that start companies with $74 in their pocketbook, right? And eventually end on the other side of it where we can create scholarships and become limited partners in funds, become angel investors and start companies again. And that's certainly one of the great concepts that's been working in Silicon Valley for a long period of time. So I know it's loaded. I kind of laughed at myself when you use that as a bio because I know you can read into it all sorts of different ways, but sometimes it's that simple. That's one of the things that we have here that they don't have. One of the other things that I do, and where Steve Case and I bonded in some ways, is I actually showed up and I'm live in markets where all of you don't live, right? We need you in other places. We need you in Ohio. We need you in North Carolina. We need you in Tennessee. We need you in some of these other markets where you don't live. And so some of us have to live there, right? In order to help universities figure out how to commercialize their academic research. If you look at UNC, Duke, NC State, collectively, maybe for one or both states, North and South Carolina, they have $2 billion of government grants and things of that sort running through them. They have no commensurate economic output on new company creation. So those are some of the things that I was trying to bring back, because if you look at Israel as a nation state, they were able to do a great job in tough circumstances to create a net new venture economy, and now they're 30% of worldwide cybersecurity startups are being born and funded there. So I wanted to, how do I bring that lesson to certain secondary markets in the US? So that's what I did during my walkabout until I had that dream, unfortunately.
I think we have time for just one more question. I just wanted to thank you for your talk. And actually, as far as the Alexa goes, I actually come from a healthcare background. And I actually got an Alexa for my 94-year-old mom who has early stage dementia. and she uses it to really find out what day and time it is, because that's very important for her. So I wanted to just kind of get your feedback from a healthcare perspective, and what are the things you see going down the pipe from healthcare, and how speech recognition can help maybe early stroke detection, things along those lines.
That's exactly right. I mean, look at the recording of the things that I'm saying, right? I mean, I have certain colleagues that are working those difficult problems now, where we can probably predict 10 years from now I'm going to have a certain ailment just based on my speech patterns. And I hope we're at a point with this new Apple Watch that was announced yesterday as well, with the ECG and things of that sort, that we'll be able to start looking at you as in a three-dimensional way to say, here's all the possible things that could go wrong. Now try doing X, Y, or Z in a preventive way. Here's why these AI assistants are dumb. Do you know how many brands just want to use things like this to just, hey, we're going to go through a drive-through line, and I'm going to look over and say, I want a hamburger and I want a Coke. That's it. That's what they want. They reduce costs, right? They can connect the dots on whether the human is fulfilling the order correctly to prevent shrinkage and things like that. They can free the human up for, would you like fries with that, for upsell opportunities, right? These are parlor tricks. These are things that literally wouldn't get me out of bed for. Now, you know what is compelling from a healthcare perspective? All of these IoT, all of this healthcare stuff, all of these things that are coming. What fast food brand do you think will win all sorts of market share when it actually chirped back and said, nope, I'm not giving you that. You're under doctor's orders to reduce your cholesterol and all of this other stuff, but we'll get you this nice salad and bottle of water instead. And it's a special San Francisco keepsake edition that's a Leaning Tower of Pisa here. No, that's what needs to happen. Again, these things are so rudimentary, right? But give credit in some ways, right? These big companies are working on more scale, getting more international languages and things like that. As Bezos said, these are first pitch of first inning products, right? Of course, people like me are frustrated, but thank God, I didn't start in this field in 1981, at least, when David did. At least maybe I'll see the fruits of some of my stuff, and I didn't have to wait 20 years. I only had to wait 10 years in order to start talking to these televisions and things of that sort. Who knows? But I think that the types of things that these AI assistants can do is going to be a lot more than just general Q&A. I'll tell you what's missing. Right now it's Q&A. You're doing very rudimentary workflows and processes. Things like, order me dog food. Okay, I'll order you. What's the next evolution after that? It's decision support. Hey, AI, it's the open enrollment period at my workplace. Should I take medical option A or B? Well, okay, in families like yours, and let me look at your HSA account, and let me look at the types of ailments that your family is dealing with. I suggest that you take option B, and here's why. And I've optimized it so that you have the least hit to your HSA, you take most advantage of your insurance policy, and that way we've made the most optimal choice on these types of things. That stuff doesn't even exist. Why? We need startups to be working on those types of things. That's why it's so early. I mean, all of us can sit here individually, and you guys can spitball and complain, run after me with pitchforks, and come up with 10 things that you think should be in those things. The way that they're designed is too much mechanical Turk. These things are going to have to start learning that we care about some of these things by itself, the way that we see humans organized today. That's what we're working on. We're trying to figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Igor.
Thank you.